The limp came first. That was what Dr. Ashford noticed when Laura Bennett moved through Seattle General's Houston campus at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, her right hip dragging fractionally with each step toward the trauma bay. He didn't see the precisely controlled breathing that kept the pain invisible after 12-hour rotations. He didn't see the Silver Star citation buried in a storage unit 3 states away, or the folded commendation letter in her apartment that she read at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. He saw probationary badge. He saw quiet. He saw manageable. Laura navigated the fluorescent corridors with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd learned precision under fire, though no one at Seattle General knew that the calm night nurse had once held the rank of major in the Army Nurse Corps before a mortar blast in Ramadi shattered her hip and ended that life. The antiseptic smell hung thick in the cold air of the trauma bay as she restocked the crash cart with methodical movements, airway supplies in ascending order, defibrillator pads aligned, for catheters arranged by gauge. Her hands moved like they were remembering something her brain had tried to forget. 14 gauge. 18 gauge. 20 gauge. Each one placed where she could find it blind, the way she'd learned in forward operating base hammer when darkness meant something other than night shift. The nurse's station hummed with the familiar sounds of a hospital waiting for emergency. Monitor cables coiled like snakes on the desk. Her badge clattered against the edge of the counter as she reached for the shift report. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular frequency that could drive a person to insanity if they listened too hard. Laura didn't listen. She'd trained herself not to listen to anything unnecessary. Focus on the work. Let everything else fade to background static. She paused at the supply closet around midnight, the small cramped space where she kept her personal locker between boxes of sterile gloves and stacks of compression bandages. Her fingers found the faded object she kept tucked behind her spare shoes, a Delta Force unit patch worn to threads, the insignia barely visible under years of handling. She touched it the way some people touched rosaries. Once. Brief. Then closed her locker and returned to the floor. The patch meant nothing here. The major rank meant nothing here. Here she was just Laura, the probationary night nurse who moved a little slower on her right side and didn't talk much at lunch. The limp became more pronounced toward shift end, a slight drag of her right leg that intensified around 3 a.m. when the pain medication she didn't take would have helped. She masked it by leaning against the nurse's station, redistributing her weight while she charted intake vitals on a 62-year-old with diabetic complications. Her colleague Diane glanced over, concern flickering across her face. Laura met her gaze for exactly 1 second, a dismissal disguised as a smile, then returned to her charting. Concern was a luxury she couldn't afford. Concern meant questions. Questions meant explanations. Explanations meant exposure. Dr. Ashford arrived for his overnight administrative rounds at 3:15 a.m., his expensive shoes clicking against the polished tile with the rhythm of someone accustomed to the sound of his own footsteps. The Ferragamo leather caught the hallway light like a weapon. His eyes moved across the trauma bay staff with the careful assessment of someone inventorying assets, cataloging who might be useful and who might be expendable. He was the kind of man who wore his privilege like cologne, impossible to ignore, invisible to those who'd grown accustomed to its smell. He watched Laura struggle with the supply cart near the medication lockup, her jaw tight as her right leg took the weight, the cart rolling unevenly across the linoleum. She was wearing her probationary badge clipped to her scrub pocket. She was moving like she had something to prove. She was exactly the kind of person who could be broken by the right kind of pressure applied in the right kind of way. Ashford smiled. Probationary employees were chess pieces. They hadn't earned tenure. They hadn't built allies. One wrong move and they disappeared. Laura felt the weight of his attention the way animals feel a predator entering the territory, a change in air pressure, a vibration in the ground beneath the surface. She didn't turn. She continued restocking the cart with the measured, deliberate movements of someone performing a ritual she'd performed 10,000 times before. But her shoulders straightened infinitesimally. Her breathing deepened by half an inch. The part of her that had trained at Fort Sam Houston, that had deployed twice to Ramadi, that had held hands while soldiers died on stretchers, that part of her recognized the threat. She met Ashford's gaze once. Just a flicker. A moment of eye contact that lasted less than a second. But in that moment, something shifted. He saw past the limp to the woman underneath. For just an instant, the composure cracked and something harder showed through, something that made his confidence hesitate. Then it was gone. Laura had already looked away, returning her attention to the crash cart with the indifference of someone who'd already dismissed him from her mind. She reordered the defibrillator pads. She straightened the endotracheal tubes. Ashford's smile died. He didn't like people who looked at him like that. He didn't like eyes that didn't flinch. He didn't like probationary night nurses who moved through his hospital with the kind of certainty that suggested they'd seen something worse than whatever he could threaten them with. He made a mental note of her badge number. Laura Bennett. Probationary. The kind of nurse who wouldn't last long if someone in administration had concerns about her stability. The trauma bay continued its rhythmic waiting. The ventilators in the adjacent ICU wheezed their mechanical breathing. A code cart sat in the corner like a metal sentinel, its drawers full of syringes and medications and the small tools of resurrection. Laura walked past it the way soldiers walk past guns in an armory, aware of the weight, aware of the potential, aware that in a crisis, it would be her hands reaching for whatever she needed. Not the doctors who stayed in their offices with their expensive shoes and their portable whiskies. Not the administrators with their degrees and their hierarchies. Her. She'd held arterial bleeders together in Ramadi with nothing but field dressing and muscle memory and the raw refusal to let someone die on her watch. She'd intubated patients with equipment that was held together with duct tape. She'd performed procedures that weren't in any textbook because the textbook assumed you had working power and for access and a surgical team. The hip pain was background noise. The limp was irrelevant. The probationary status was temporary. What she didn't know was that the colonel who commanded her son's unit overseas was currently 37 miles away on a military transport, his arterial bleed already beginning to bleed through fresh bandages. What she didn't know was that within 4 hours, Seattle General's trauma bay would become a battleground between her instinct to save lives and an administrator's instinct to protect himself. What she didn't know was that in 240 minutes, 12 doctors would walk past his bed, one after another, following orders from a man in expensive shoes who was already calculating how to frame her destruction. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she would be ready. The overhead page crackled at 0300, the receptionist's voice pulling every nurse on the floor to attention. Nurse Nightingale to administration. Nurse Nightingale to administration. Each syllable dripped with mockery, the derogatory nickname echoing through the corridors of Seattle General's Houston campus like a bell announcing something precious and fragile. Laura heard the suppressed laughter from the trauma bay. She set down her charting tablet, her limp more pronounced after 14 hours on her feet, and walked toward Ashford's temporary office with a kind of measured pace that revealed nothing. He didn't look up from his desk when she entered. The overhead fluorescents hummed their electronic drone, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made human skin look like it belonged to something already half dead. Ashford wore a $3,000 suit that moved wrong on his frame, expensive fabric stretched over someone still learning how to wear authority. His eyes stayed fixed on whatever metrics he was studying, his silence a deliberate tool. "Your charting is quaint," he said finally. Not looking at her. "Like you learned medicine in a tent." Laura stood silent. One breath. Neutral expression. The kind of composure that came from standing in forward operating bases while mortars whistled overhead, from holding pressure on wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, from knowing that showing emotion meant people died. She'd learned that in tents, actually. In FOB Hammer outside Ramadi, in 2008, when she was Major Bennett instead of just another night nurse. The other nurses call you Nightingale. Ashford turned to face her now, his smile sharp as a scalpel. Because you hover. Because you're precious about protocols. Because you're the type who thinks nursing is a calling. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. It's not. It's a job. And you're not particularly good at it. One measured breath. She met his eyes. I chart thoroughly because lives depend on accuracy, Dr. Ashford. His laugh came soft. Clinical. Lives? How dramatic. He turned back to his tablet. You can go. The supply closet ambush came 2 nights later, during the shift change chaos when half the floor was preoccupied with handoffs and the other half were already thinking about getting home. Laura was reaching for replacement blood pressure cuffs when Ashford slipped through the narrow door behind her, closing it with the kind of quiet that suggested planning. The fluorescent light above them flickered, casting his face in alternating shadow and sickly illumination. Shelving units rose on either side, boxes of saline and for tubing creating a narrow corridor where no one could see them from the hallway. His voice dropped to something almost gentle. Almost concerned. The tone of a predator that had learned to mimic empathy. Probationary employees serve at department discretion. Laura turned, her hand still on a box of cuffs. Her heart rate climbed, but her face remained neutral. This was the moment he'd been building toward. This was where he thought he'd break something. Where he thought her limp made her fragile. I've reviewed your file, Ashford continued, stepping closer into the narrow space. Civilian nursing degree. No prestigious background. No connections. No family in medicine. No one who would ask uncomfortable questions. His eyes moved down her body as if taking inventory. You understand how easily positions are reconsidered. How quickly a probationary status can become terminated. How a single phone call to HR about performance concerns, reliability issues, could end this job before you even qualify for benefits. There it was. The threat, plain and unadorned. Laura's left eye burned, not with tears yet, but with the pressure of something held back. She let it happen. Let one tear escape and track down her cheek. Let him see it. Then she wiped it away with steady fingers without breaking eye contact. I understand perfectly. Ashford smiled. He thought he'd won. The parking lot demotion came during the shift change overlap, 12 nurses gathering near their cars in the Texas heat that persisted even at night. The asphalt radiated warmth like something alive, the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with antiseptic from their clothes. Ashford stood beside his black Mercedes, tailored suit already showing sweat stains at the armpits, Laura standing before him holding a manila folder. It was choreography. He'd planned this audience carefully. Effective immediately, you're transferred to the psychiatric wing, Ashford announced, his voice carrying across the parking lot, ensuring every nurse heard every word. Your trauma bay privileges are revoked. You'll report to Dr. Chen at 0700 tomorrow. 12 nurses watched. Someone whispered. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, that particular quality it takes on when something irreversible is happening. Laura took one measured breath. Only one. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. When she spoke, the words came out with the precision of someone who'd learned that clarity was more devastating than volume. I've treated men with more integrity bleeding out in the sand than you'll ever possess in a corner office. She turned and walked away, her limp pronounced, her cardigan hanging loose from one shoulder. The whispers followed her like wind. Behind her, she heard Ashford's voice, tight now, trying to salvage his moment. You're dismissed, Nurse Bennett. But the damage was done, not to her but to him. He hadn't expected her to hit back. Not with words. Not with something that would echo through the hospital for weeks. Tyrants operated on the assumption that their victims would beg or cry or apologize. They had no framework for dignity. Laura made it to the bus stop on Fannin Street before she allowed herself to think about what had just happened. The rubber bench was warm from the day's heat, and the cardboard box under her arm suddenly felt impossibly heavy. In her mind's eye, she could still see his face in the moment before she'd spoken. The confusion. The calculation of how to respond. The realization that she wasn't following the script he'd written for her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she now understood exactly what was about to happen. Ashford had been boxed in by his own performance. He'd made her removal public, which meant he needed to justify it, which meant he had to accelerate whatever he'd planned for the Colonel. Which meant the Colonel's life just became dramatically more fragile. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to a photograph she'd carried for 7 years, Sergeant David Bennett in dress blues, grinning at the camera in front of a Humvee in Helmand Province. Her son. The young man who'd called her every Friday until a Taliban sniper ended that conversation. Colonel James Harker had written the letter, the official one, explaining how David had covered the team's extraction. How he'd bought them time with his body and his blood. That same colonel was right now upstairs in the trauma bay of the hospital where Ashford had just publicly ensured he'd received no protection. Laura's hands were absolutely steady as she dialed the number she'd memorized but never used. The number that connected to a Pentagon switchboard. The number that would send a message to people who still remembered her name, her rank, a particular set of skills. When the voice answered, she spoke with the kind of authority that came from having nothing left to lose. This is Major Bennett. Recall sequence Nightingale Actual. I need extraction protocol activated. Code, Delta. Location, Seattle General, Houston Campus. Patient, Colonel James Harker, Delta Force. Threat level, active sabotage, institutional. The pause on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then, Roger, Major. Stand by. Help is coming. The rotor wash hit the roof at 1900 hours, and every window in Seattle General's psychiatric wing rattled like teeth chattering. Laura felt it before she heard it, that deep percussion that lives in your bones after you've been extracted under fire. The Black Hawk descended through Houston's humid evening, and she stopped mid-sentence during her orientation on the 3rd floor, her hand frozen on a medication cart. That's a medevac, the charge nurse beside her said absently, not looking up from the patient roster. Laura was already moving. Not running. Never running. But her feet carried her toward the stairwell in that measured way her body had learned in Ramadi, the way you move when you need to see something and can't afford to be noticed. 3 flights down. Through the cardiac corridor. To the window overlooking the trauma bays where the helicopter's rotor was still turning, still pushing that wall of wind and noise across the landing zone. The colonel came down on a stretcher at 1907, his body a landscape of 4 lines and oxygen tubing. 2 flight medics flanked him, their movements precise and urgent. Laura's breath caught, but she didn't move. Didn't blink. Just watched as they wheeled him through the trauma bay doors below. She knew that face. Not from television or briefings or photographs passed through secure channels. She knew that face because her son had described it in an email written 3 weeks before an IED turned a Humvee into a funeral. Colonel Marcus Harker. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines liaison to the Delta Force operations in Fallujah's Jolan district. The man who'd written the letter about how Sergeant Thomas Bennett died covering his team's extraction. The man who'd personally decorated her son's casket with a unit patch. The same patch her son had worn sewn inside his jacket lining. The same patch she recognized now, visible beneath the colonel's hospital gown as they transferred him from the stretcher to the trauma bay bed. Faded. Thread-worn. A Delta Force unit identifier that should have been classified, that should never have been visible to anyone without a top-secret clearance. It was visible because the colonel had carried her son's patch inside his own jacket since the day Sergeant Bennett died. A memorial. A weight. A promise that the dead don't get forgotten. Laura pressed her palm against the window. The glass was warm from the Houston afternoon, and below her, the trauma team was already moving. Surgical lights blazed. Monitors chirped. The colonel's eyes were half open, glassy with sedation, his left leg wrapped in field dressings that were already weeping through. That's when she saw Ashford. He moved through the trauma bay with a fluidity that Laura recognized instantly, not the fluid motion of a skilled trauma surgeon, but the fluid motion of a man executing a choreography. His right hand was already moving toward the crash cart. His fingers were already sorting through the preloaded syringes. Not checking their labels. Not verifying doses. Moving with the practiced speed of repetition, the way a thief's hand moves when it's lifted the same wallet 100 times. Laura's focus shattered. She watched him pocket something, a small pre-filled syringe, amber-colored liquid, the kind of thing a night shift supervisor might not immediately miss from a cart that would be restocked within the hour. She watched his jaw tighten as one of the attending physicians asked a question about the colonel's injury pattern. She watched Ashford's eyes flick toward the vascular surgery team, who were already moving toward the colonel's side with ultrasound equipment. He was afraid. Laura had seen that look before. In the faces of junior soldiers who suddenly understood they were about to lose control of a situation. In the eyes of men who'd made a calculation and found the variables shifting against them. Ashford's strategic removal of the fentanyl from the crash cart was one thing, reckless, criminal, but manageable if it went unnoticed. But a Delta Force officer arriving with a serious injury? A colonel who would have security clearance briefings, who would have people asking questions about his care, who would have military personnel waiting in the lobby before his first surgery was complete. That was a problem Ashford couldn't control. She watched him step away from the trauma bay. Watched him move to the wall phone with the smooth precision of a man who'd just decided something. His voice was low, barely audible through the window's glass, but his body language was unmistakable. The slight tilt of his head. The way his free hand gestured, not aggressively, but with the calm authority of a man who expected to be obeyed. Within 17 minutes, the vascular surgery team was being called away from the trauma bay. Not by name. Not by direct order. But by a quiet word from the surgical scheduler that there was a VIP cardiac patient on the 4th floor who needed their expertise urgently. The colonel's injury was stable for the moment, the scheduler explained. They could send another team. No need to tie up the vascular specialists when there was acute need elsewhere. Laura knew the math. She'd done the calculus in her head before the scheduler finished speaking. One Delta Force colonel with a serious arterial injury and no vascular team. 12 trauma doctors theoretically on call tonight. A systematic restructuring of access points that would begin the moment Ashford made his next 3 phone calls. She moved away from the window. Not quickly. Not in panic. She walked back toward the psychiatric wing with her shoulders level and her breathing steady, the way she'd learned to move when the outcome had already been decided and the only question left was how long you could make the inevitable take. At 19:45, her badge no longer opened the trauma bay doors. She discovered this when she tried to check on a patient report and the electronic lock simply didn't respond to her badge swipe. The security light blinked red. The door remained closed. She tried twice more, in case it was a technical glitch. The card reader was functioning fine. It was her access that had been revoked. She found the surgical board in the nursing station at 2010. The colonel's case was listed. 12 doctors were marked as on-call for the night. None of them were assigned to his care. The assignments read like a study in systemic misdirection. Dr. Patterson to VIP cardiac case, 4th floor. Dr. Chen to emergency appendectomy, 2nd floor. Dr. Ramadi to trauma consult in the ED. Every attending and resident carefully distributed to every floor except the one where Colonel Harker lay with a deteriorating arterial bleed and mounting sepsis risk. It's the schedule, the electronic note read, timestamped 1943. Dr. Ashford has directed all available trauma surgeons to priority cases. Colonel Harker's team is the next available rotation. Estimated wait time, 6 hours. Laura's jaw tightened. That wasn't a tightness of fear. It was the tightness of restraint. The specific muscular response of someone holding themselves steady when every fiber of their being wanted to move. At 21:30, her electronic schedule updated. She'd been reassigned to double shifts in the psychiatric wing. 2 16-hour blocks back-to-back, no overlap with Colonel Harker's care team, no breaks that would allow her to move between floors without an explanation she'd have to give. The message was embedded in the scheduling system like a splinter: you are being watched. You are being isolated. You are being removed. Sandra found her at the medication cart at 21:45. The charge nurse was a 20-year veteran with grey threading through her dark hair and the kind of eyes that had seen every permutation of institutional cruelty. She glanced left and right before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. He's asking about the vascular team. The Colonel. Laura's hands didn't pause. She continued counting out the 0.5 milligrams haloperidol tablets into their paper cups, each movement precise and separate. Ashford reassigned them. Sandra continued. Called them away personally. Said the Colonel was stable. Said there was acute need elsewhere. Now the Colonel's vitals are trending wrong and I can't get anyone to answer pages. Laura finally looked up. Sandra's face was troubled in that specific way that comes from watching the machinery of medicine stop working the way it's supposed to. The way a good nurse's face looks when she's watched someone choose institutional survival over patient care. The doctors? Laura asked. Her voice had dropped an octave without her permission. That was happening now, her voice changing in her throat like she was shedding something. 12 listed as on call. They're all upstairs. All busy. All somehow unavailable. Sandra's hands gripped the edge of the medication cart. I've worked cardiac for 20 years. I know the priorities. A VIP case doesn't usually pull the entire vascular team. Laura looked past Sandra toward the window overlooking the trauma bays. The Colonel's room was 2 floors down. Even from here, she could see the monitors reflecting in the darkened glass, the rhythmic beeping of a man's vital signs being tracked but not necessarily being saved. At what point, Sandra asked quietly, does a scheduling conflict become something else? Laura didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both already knew. At 22:15, Laura walked past the Colonel's ICU room under the pretense of retrieving something from the medication dispensary. The door was partially open. The room was empty of visitors, empty of attending physicians, empty of anyone whose job it was to notice that his oxygen saturation was holding at 92% and his heart rate was climbing. A trauma patient alone at night with nothing but machines for company is a trauma patient who's been abandoned. She saw the unit patch clearly now. Beneath the hospital gown, in the space where the Colonel's jacket had been cut away. Faded threads. A delta symbol. The same symbol her son had worn. The same symbol that meant he'd died in service to men like this one, that he'd covered their extraction, that he'd burned away before his 23rd birthday so this man could live. Ashford appeared at her shoulder like smoke condensing in cold air. I've made calls about potential infectious complications, he said quietly. His voice was clinical. His hands were steady at his sides. A man executing the next phase of a plan. We're being cautious. Preventing cross-contamination. Stop hovering. Laura didn't move. Didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge him with anything but the briefest inclination of her head. He waited for her response, some protest, some question, some moment where she'd show him her weakness. When nothing came, when she simply stood there with her shoulders level and her breathing steady, his jaw tightened. He'd expected panic. He'd expected tears. He'd expected the thing he'd been engineering since that moment in the supply closet when he realized she was a threat he hadn't anticipated. What he got instead was the terrible silence of someone who'd already made their own calculations. At 23:01, the Colonel's monitors began to sing their warning song. Not a critical alarm yet. Just a steady escalation. Heart rate climbing from 94 to 108 to 122. Blood pressure wavering. Oxygen saturation drifting downward like a stone sinking through dark water. Laura watched from the nursing station as the overhead speakers clicked on. Code light flashing. Red emergency notification on the digital board. All 12 doctors suddenly required. All 12 doctors suddenly unavailable. All 12 doctors busy with other cases that had somehow accumulated the priority while the Delta Force Colonel's arterial bleed was downgraded to stable for observation. She watched them walk. Past the Colonel's room. Toward the elevators. Toward the VIP patient 2 floors down. 12 physicians in a slow-motion exodus, their pages buzzing, their attention diverted, their professional obligation redirected by a single administrator's calculated word. Laura moved toward the Colonel's room. Ashford was suddenly in her path, blocking the doorway with his body, his hand extended like a gate. "You're not trauma certified anymore," he said quietly. "Stand down." She could see his eyes now. Saw the calculation there. The certainty that he'd won. The absolute conviction that a probationary nurse with a destroyed career and destroyed reputation would never cross the boundary he'd drawn. She looked at his hand. Then at his face. Then at the unit patch visible in the colonel's bed beyond him. "Help is coming," she said. Her voice had dropped so low it barely carried. It was a voice that had issued orders in forward operating base Hammer. It was the voice of someone who'd triaged the dying under fire. Ashford blinked. Once. He didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. The monitor shrieked at 0200. 3 short bursts. Then silence. Laura's eyes snapped open from the desk chair outside Colonel Harker's room. The cardiac alarm, not the ventilator alarm, not the pressure cuff cycling. The colonel's pressure dropping. Falling fast. She moved to the window. His chest barely rose. The EKG traced a line that belonged to a dying man. The overhead pager crackled with Ashford's voice, "Surgical consult to cardiac intensive care. All available surgical staff. Now." His voice carried that particular precision of someone orchestrating. Not requesting. Commanding. She watched them walk past. 1, 2, 3. The vascular surgeon who'd been assigned to the colonel yesterday, Dr. Meeks, a man with steady hands and better judgment, turned the corner toward the elevators without hesitation. 4, 5, 6. The trauma attending checked his phone, read whatever message Ashford had sent him, and pivoted toward the stairwell. 7, 8. The residents, the interns, the fellows. 12. All 12 members of the on-call surgical staff passed the colonel's room like he was furniture. Like he was already a body. The monitor continued its descent. 90 systolic. 85, 80. Laura reached for the door handle. Ashford stood 50 feet down the corridor, phone pressed to his ear, watching her. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. His expression carried the satisfaction of a man watching his design come together, all the pieces moving exactly as calculated. No surgical intervention. No rescue. Just a strategic void where life-saving should be. She stepped inside Harker's room and closed the door. The zip ties were in her psychiatric kit. She'd kept supplies there for 3 years, items no one questioned a night nurse carrying between floors. Restraints, safety equipment, items that belonged in the world of sedation and behavioral protocols. She looped one around the exterior door handle, then threaded it through the interior handle and pulled it tight. The plastic band snapped secure. Not locked. Just delayed. Just enough time. The colonel's eyes were closed. His breathing shallow. The 4 lines ran clear. No vasopressors running. Ashford had made sure of that too. Laura moved to her locker. The key turned in the lock. 3 years. 36 months since she'd held this knife and not thought about Ramadi. The combat medic knife was wrapped in hospital gauze, the blade still dark with old oil. The kind of knife that had belonged to her son first, that she'd carried after the funeral, that she'd kept because throwing it away felt like throwing away proof that any of it had happened. Any of the sand. Any of the screaming. Any of the moment when her son's voice went silent on the radio. She unwrapped it in the colonel's room. The colonel's O2 sat was 78. Dropping. His pressure traced lower. His chest cavity was filling with blood. She could hear the wet sound of his breathing, the pneumothorax developing, the way his lungs were running out of space. Laura ripped open his gown. Her hands moved to the betadine bottle without conscious decision. The 4th intercostal space. Left anterolateral. Muscle memory from a forward operating base 12,000 miles away took control. Her mind wanted to forget Ramadi. Her hands remembered perfectly. The incision was clean. 6 inches. The scalpel gave way to the blade, bone separating, tissue opening. No trembling. No hesitation. Pain was data, and the data said this man was bleeding to death in a room full of doctors who'd been told to let him. She found the source immediately, a missed arterial bleeder, probably oozing for 6 hours, now catastrophic. The rib spread. Her gloved hand went directly to the site. The hemostats from the crash cart, 14-gauge needle driver, surgical grade, exactly what she needed, clamped down on the vessel. Once. Twice. The bleeding stopped. The colonel's oxygen sat climbed. 82, 85. 88, stable. His eyes opened. Met hers. He didn't speak. Didn't move. Just the smallest nod, a man recognizing that the woman standing over him with blood on her scrubs had just chosen his life over her career. The door burst open at 0214. Not the doctors. Security. 2 officers in grey uniforms, badges catching the fluorescent light, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who didn't know they were too late. The zip tie hung from the door handle, already snapping. Behind them, visible through the doorway, Dr. Ashford. Phone at his ear. Already talking. Yes, the patient is stable, he was saying. His voice calm. Professional. Unshakable. We're addressing the situation now. Laura set down the hemostats. 1 measured breath. Her hands were soaked red, not trembling, not shaking, just soaked in the colonel's blood and the weight of exactly what she'd done. His arterial bleeder ruptured at 0200, she said. Her voice didn't crack. All 12 surgical staff were paged away. He was bleeding into his thoracic cavity. Step back from the patient, one of the security officers said. Not unkindly. Just procedural. She stepped back. Ashford was still on the phone. Yes. Unauthorized procedure. With a knife. Yes, I witnessed the patient's condition myself before he paused, listening to whoever was on the other end of the line. The board. It had to be. He'd called the board at 0200, ready with his narrative before she'd even found the bleeder. I'm documenting everything now. Yes. She'll be escorted from the building immediately. The officers looked at the open chest. At the hemostats. At the colonel's rising oxygen saturation. At Laura's bloodstained scrubs. They knew. The look on their faces said they knew exactly what had happened here. They also knew they had no authority to make the call. By 0330, the surgical team had been called back, the real surgical team, not the ones Ashford had scattered. They'd arrived to find the colonel stable, the bleed clamped, his vitals climbing. The chief of surgery had looked at the field thoracotomy, at the precision of the hemostasis, at the woman in the corner with her hand soaked red. By 0345, that same chief of surgery was speaking quietly with 2 hospital lawyers. By 0400, Laura's badge was deactivated. She'd walked out through the main lobby with a cardboard box in her arms. The security guard at the desk, a man she'd treated kindly for 3 years, who'd made her coffee on her night shifts, didn't make eye contact as her card was swiped useless at the turnstile. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause. Fannin Street was empty at 0415. Just the bus stop, the concrete bench, and Laura. The cardboard box held her thermos, the wilting succulent from her locker, a cracked coffee mug from the hospital break room, and the academy photo of her son in his dress blues. David. Age 22. Sergeant. Dead at 23 under the command of the man whose life she'd just saved while losing her own. The rain soaked through her scrubs. Through the thin jacket she'd grabbed. Into the cardboard box, darkening the corners. A bus passed. Not hers. She didn't board it. Another bus came 10 minutes later. She watched it arrive, watched other passengers board, watched the hydraulic doors close. She didn't move. The rain continued. Cold for Houston. Angry. The kind of rain that belonged to another climate, another time, another life when she'd been someone with a rank and a purpose and a son who answered his radio. Her phone buzzed in her scrub pocket. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It buzzed again. Different number. Then again. And again. Calls coming in waves, like someone was calling all the contacts they could find, passing phones down a chain of command, asking people to reach out to a woman who'd just committed career suicide to save a Delta Force colonel. She silenced the phone. The cardboard box sagged in the rain. David's photo was getting wet. His academy smile starting to blur. She tucked it deeper into the box, angling the top corner to shed water. A car pulled into the bus stop parking lot. Not a personal vehicle. Not civilian. A black sedan with government plates. Two men in dark suits emerged, moving with the purposeful grace of people trained by the federal government. They didn't need to ask which woman was Laura Bennett. There was only one woman sitting in the rain at 0 for 5 in a hospital parking lot with a cardboard box containing her dead son. They sat down on the bench beside her without asking permission. Major Bennett, the first one, said. Not a question. A confirmation. We need you to come with us. She didn't turn to look at them. I'm not active anymore, she said. Her voice sounded like someone speaking from underwater. No, the second man said. He had the accent of someone from Charleston. Military family, probably. The kind of composure that came from understanding exactly what she'd done and why. You're not. But the man you just saved is, and he's been trying to reach you for an hour. The rain continued. He says his commanding general called the hospital administrator, Charleston said. There's going to be a conversation about what happened tonight. And you need to be part of it. Not as a nurse. As what you actually are. Laura finally turned. The second man was holding out a phone. Not hers. A government phone, the kind with encrypted protocols and lines that ran directly to people with actual power. The voice on the other end was Colonel Harker's, though it took her a moment to recognize it, weak from blood loss, but unmistakable. Major Bennett, he said. I need you to listen very carefully. 8 hours after the press conference ended with the colonel's voice cutting Dr. Ashford's microphone to silence, 2 federal agents in dark windbreakers appeared at Seattle General's entrance with warrants folded in their coat pockets and purpose written across their faces. The first agent was tall, early 50s, with the kind of stillness that came from never wasting motion. The second was younger, female, moving with the efficient precision of someone who'd learned to navigate institutional power before she could legally drink. They took the elevator to the 3rd floor where Dr. Ashford's office overlooked the parking lot like a general's tent surveying conquered territory. His nameplate was still on the door. That wouldn't last long. The raid took 43 minutes. They found 14 pre-filled fentanyl syringes in his locked desk drawer, each labeled with dates and initials that didn't match any official log. They found pharmacy records showing requisitions that exceeded patient numbers by a factor of 3. They found his personal journal, his mistake, his arrogance, where he documented financial pressures, a wife threatening divorce, a gambling debt to a Biloxi casino, a lifestyle that required more than a doctor's salary could justify. The officers photographed everything, catalogued everything, and when they placed the syringes in an evidence bag, the hiss of air escaping sounded like institutional death. By the time they left his office at 2,200 hours, Dr. Ashford's career had already stopped breathing. The surgical logs came next. Colonel James Harker's lawyer, a woman named Patricia Graves who had litigated against the Pentagon and won, had compiled 14 months of pharmacy records cross-referenced with the hospital's trauma rotation schedule. The pattern was surgical in its precision. Every shift where fentanyl went missing from the crash cart, every date, every controlled substance, every moment aligned perfectly with Dr. Ashford's presence in the building. The logs showed that on the night Colonel Harker arrived bleeding out, the fentanyl count was down by 4 units. On the night Laura performed the field thoracotomy in his chest with a knife and muscle memory, the count was down by 6. Ashford hadn't just been stealing medication. He'd been documenting his own betrayal in hospital records, confident no one would look closely enough to see it. The medical board convened an emergency hearing at 0600 the next morning in a conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and imminent reckoning. Ashford sat alone at the defendant's table. No lawyer. No ally. No one willing to sit beside him. The board chairman was Dr. Robert Chen, a cardiologist with 42 years of practice and a reputation for precision. He opened a folder containing 2 inches of documentation. Phone records. Pharmacy logs. Security footage from the trauma bay. Testimony from 17 nurses. The first board member, a woman with silver hair and harder eyes, began reading the charges in a voice that carried the weight of professional betrayal. Dr. Ashford, on March 15 at 1900 hours, you accessed the crash cart in Trauma Bay 4 and removed for pre-filled syringes of fentanyl. This occurred during a critical patient case. According to the crash cart inventory protocol, these items should have been accounted for immediately. They were not. The second board member continued, on March 16 at 0200 hours, an additional 6 units of fentanyl went missing from the pharmacy during your shift rotation. The pharmacy technician on duty states you were the only personnel with access during this window. Ashford's jaw clenched. His expensive suit, custom-tailored, Italian silk, purchased when he believed himself untouchable, was rumpled now, sweat stains visible under the overhead lights. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. The silence stretched like a held breath before a code call. Dr. Chen placed security footage on the table. The trauma bay the night Colonel Harker arrived. Ashford visible at the crash cart, his hands moving with practiced speed, moving to his pockets, moving like a man who'd done this before. The board watched the footage without expression. The hospital security system shows you at this location at 1947, Chen said quietly. 32 seconds of video. Your hands. He paused. Tap the image. Moving to your pockets. The same motion, the same speed, repeated across 73 occasions over 14 months. The third board member's voice was softer, which made it somehow worse. Dr. Ashford, you were entrusted with the lives of patients and the integrity of this institution. You violated both. The evidence is conclusive. Ashford remained silent. His lawyer, newly hired, visibly uncomfortable, whispered something to him. Ashford shook his head. Do you have a statement? Chen asked. Ashford stared at his hands. Hands that had held scalpels. Hands that had pocketed stolen fentanyl. Hands that had orchestrated the abandonment of a patient to cover his theft. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin as tissue paper. I thought she was nobody. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their mechanical dirge. Dr. Chen removed his glasses. Met Ashford's eyes. When the board chairman spoke, his voice carried the weight of institutional judgment. That was your first mistake. The vote took for minutes. The result was unanimous. Dr. Ashford's medical license was revoked effective immediately. He was remanded to criminal prosecution for theft of controlled substances, patient endangerment, and fraud. His apartment building security footage showed him leaving at 0847 with 3 suitcases and a face like a man watching his own life end. His Mercedes was repossessed by 1400. Criminal charges were filed by 1600. His lawyer negotiated a plea bargain, 2 years minimum security, full restitution, permanent ban from medical practice anywhere in the United States. His sentencing hearing lasted 11 minutes. The judge asked if he had anything to say. Ashford stared at his hands and said nothing. The gavel came down like a period at the end of a sentence. Life ended. A new one began. 6 months later, Laura Bennett walked through Seattle General's main entrance at 0600, and everything was different. Her new ID badge read Director of Trauma Services. The laminated card caught the morning light as she passed through the security checkpoint, the woman at the desk, not the same one from before, nodding with immediate recognition. Laura's limp was still present, but it no longer apologized for itself. She'd commissioned a cane, walnut wood with her unit insignia engraved along the shaft, a reminder carved into the material that walked with her now. Her gait reflected earned authority rather than injury. Major Laura Bennett had never worn her rank in a uniform at this hospital. She wore it now in every step. The night security guard stood at the reception desk in a polyester uniform, ill-fitting across the shoulders of a man used to tailored suits. His name tag read A. Ashford, Security. He was processing a visitor badge when Laura passed, and his eyes dropped like weights sinking. He couldn't meet her gaze. Wouldn't. She paused. Took one measured breath. Continued toward the elevator. "Good morning," she said quietly. He nodded. Silent. The only words left to him were the ones printed on his badge. Laura's new office was on the administrative level, overlooking the trauma bay from a vantage point that showed her everything: the resuscitation bays, the surgical preparation stations, the arrival dock where the helicopters landed. Morning light streamed through the windows, touching everything with gold. On her desk, positioned where morning light caught them, were two things: a framed photograph of her son, David Bennett, in his academy dress whites, smiling with the kind of confidence that only lasted until Ramadi, and beside it, mounted in a simple frame, the faded Delta Force unit patch she'd cut from Colonel Harker's jacket lining when she'd opened his chest to save his life. The same patch David had worn. The same insignia that connected them across time and death and the impossible work of saving what could still be saved. At 0630, the Colonel appeared in her doorway. He walked with a cane matching hers, a gift he'd commissioned, walnut from the same craftsman, and his uniform bore the weight of a man who'd learned that survival meant living with what you carried. His eyes fell on the framed patch, and something in his expression shifted like tectonic plates finding new alignment. "Settling in, Major?" he asked. She smiled. A real smile. Not the mask she'd worn for 17 months as a nurse nobody recognized. "It's just Laura now, Colonel." "It's just James," he said. They stood at the window overlooking the trauma bay where 12 residents were beginning their morning rounds, their faces bright with the confidence of education and capability, unaware that they were being watched by a legend who'd crawled through blood and desperation to save a life they would never know was saved. James placed a hand on her shoulder, and for the first time since the mortar blast in Ramadi that had ended her first life, Laura Bennett felt the weight of something other than loss. "David would be proud," James said quietly. Laura's hand moved to the framed patch, her fingers tracing the worn threads where morning light caught gold. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Below them, the trauma bay doors burst open. Paramedics wheeled in a critical case, a patient whose life hung in the balance of the next 30 seconds. Alarms sounded. Monitors activated. The machinery of institutional medicine roared to life. Laura set down her cane, that carved reminder of what she'd survived, and moved toward the stairs, her limp still present but no longer defining her, because the work that had always mattered continued. Her team was already assembling. Residents looked up as she entered the trauma bay, recognition dawning that something had shifted in the hierarchy of this place. This was Major Laura Bennett. This was a woman who'd held life together in a forward operating base with a knife and muscle memory. This was a woman who'd made an impossible choice and lived long enough to be proven right. "Prep for emergency thoracotomy," she commanded, her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I want 2 units of O-negative typed and crossed. Get me the 14-gauge angiocath. We have 4 minutes before cardiac arrest becomes irreversible." The residents moved. Not because they'd been trained to follow orders, but because they recognized authority when it stood in front of them wearing scrubs and carrying the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Laura Bennett took her position at the operating table, and the patient on that table had no idea that the woman saving their life had been called just a nurse 17 months ago. He had no idea that she'd been deemed nobody by a man in a polyester security uniform who'd thought institutional power made him untouchable. He had no idea. But Seattle General would remember. The system would change. Protocols would be rewritten. And trauma protocols that prioritized patient care over profit would begin with a woman who'd learned the cost of choosing power over people and had chosen differently. If you found yourself in a situation where speaking up felt impossible, or where you've been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please share your story in the comments below. And if you know someone who needs to see this, someone who's been told they're nobody, someone who's been silenced by institutional power, please share this video with them. Subscribe for more stories of people who refuse to stay silent. Your support means everything.